live. So if you're seeing this, this is the pre-show to me going live at 9 a.m. Eastern until 11 a.m. Eastern to celebrate International Podcast Day here on the House of EdTech podcast. So, yeah, I'm just going to be setting some things up here. And if you happen to see this, that means I didn't take it out. And the actual show will get started in about 5 minutes. So you may want to fast forward to the 5 minute mark when I will start the formal 2 hour live stream. But yeah, so I'm just setting things up. Got the dual monitors going here. I'm going to be talking about the Education Podcast Network and all right. So I just muted the live stream because I had that open to make sure that things were working. So I'm going to also put in a test comment. I'll say welcome. Very excited to be doing this. I got very lucky that I don't have school today because it's Rosh Hashanah today and tomorrow. So no school today and tomorrow. Okay. Cool. Very cool. All right. Let's make sure the sound is doing sound stuff. I don't want to listen to myself. So there we go on that. So the way the live stream is going to work, if you go to chrisnesi.com/join, you'll be able to be a part of the live stream. So kind of like a call-in radio show, you'll be able to come on in and share your thoughts on your favorite podcasts. If you're a podcaster, I would love to know why you started your show, how you produce your show, and we can geek out and spread the good love about podcasts. So this is very exciting. And at one point, I am going to do a segment where I'm going to talk about all of the podcasts on the Education Podcast Network, which I'm very excited to share because I'm very proud of all the work that my friends and colleagues put into the work they do on their podcasts. If you're joining in, please sharing a tweet or sharing the stream would be fantastic using hashtag International Podcast Day, hashtag House of Ed Tech. If you're watching this after the fact, certainly share it around because there is going to be a lot of great information and resources shared in this live stream and obviously later on the replay about podcasts and podcasting in general. So very exciting. Got about 2 minutes and then we are going to get going. So let me send out a promo tweet or two. "60 seconds till showtime, baby. Woohoo!" All right, it's 9 a.m. Let's get this started. Welcome to the House of Ed Tech podcast. I am your host, Chris Nesi. The House of Ed Tech explores how technology is changing the way teachers teach and the impact that technology is having in education. I discuss technology that is changing our classrooms and schools, and I share tools and tips that you can hear today and use tomorrow. You're going to hear the stories of teachers, leaders, and creators just like you. The purpose? Whether you use it or not, technology is changing the way you teach and how your students learn. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Happy International Podcast Day 2019. Welcome to the House of Ed Tech celebration of International Podcast Day 2019. It is Monday, September 30th, 2019. I am Chris Nesi, host of the House of Ed Tech podcast. Thank you for joining me here on the live stream, or thank you for checking out the replay of this live stream. For the next 2 hours, I'm going to be talking about why I podcast. I'm going to share information about the podcasts I enjoy listening to. I'm also going to be talking about the Education Podcast Network, which is podcast for educators, podcast by educators. For more, check them out at edupodcastnetwork.com. And over the course of the next couple of hours, I will get into how I create podcasts. And I want you to be a part of this video and this live stream. If you want to join in, you can go to chrisnesi.com/join. You can see that right here down below, and you will be able to come into this show. And I think that would be really fantastic for you to share podcasts you listen to. If you're a podcaster, I would certainly love to talk to you and geek out about how you do what you do when you do it. That's a lot of do. Cheap internet joke. So, good morning. This is very exciting. Any comments you post in the chat as you're watching on YouTube, you will be able, I can pull them up on screen. So for example, I made a comment welcoming people to this video in the pre-show. So I have the ability to bring up comments that you leave in the chat right here on YouTube. So if you are a little camera shy, that's okay. You're welcome to post text comments, and I will certainly address anything that you want to share here. I'd also like to strongly recommend and encourage you to share this out. So tweet about it, post it on Instagram, post it on Facebook, and just include the link chrisnesi.com/live. And that'll bring people right to the YouTube page for this live stream. And again, if you want to be a part of it, all you need to do is go to chrisnesi.com/join, and that's going to bring you right into this live stream platform. And to do this live stream, I am using something called StreamYard. And StreamYard is super cool. You can find it at StreamYard.com. And StreamYard allows a user to basically live stream, and you can push your content out to YouTube like I'm doing right here. You can also live stream to Periscope, Facebook, a personal profile, or you can live stream into a Facebook group. And you can do this all for free, which, if you know me, free is my favorite four-letter F word. And if you pay StreamYard, and I believe it's $20 or $25 a month, I'm going to say $25 a month, you can then send your stream out to a service like Restream.io. And Restream.io is really cool if you're into streaming, because Restream lets you take one video feed and simultaneously output that video stream to multiple sources. So at the same time, you could be on Periscope and Facebook and YouTube and a Facebook group and, Discord and just all these other places that you can live stream video and audio to. So that's a little bit of how I'm doing this. Okay. If you have never seen me before, again, I'm Chris Nesi, and I host the House of Ed Tech podcast. and I've been hosting the House of Ed Tech podcast since January of 2014. So as I sit here at the end of September in 2019, I'm getting ready to close out my 6th year of being a podcaster. And I got to say, podcasting has had a huge impact on my life. One of the podcasts that I listen to called School of Podcasting, hosted by Dave Jackson, proprietor of the School of Podcasting, he talks about and encourages people to share, something he calls because of my podcast stories. And my because of my podcast story at this point is super long. I've had the opportunity to speak with some really amazing people that I've had as guests on the House of Ed Tech. I've been fortunate enough because of the podcast to speak at a number of conferences. I've been fortunate enough to specifically me, little old me, be brought into a school district to speak to students and teachers about creating content. Shout out to my friends in Oxford at Oxford High School in Alabama. I certainly miss my Oxford friends. Maybe one day I'll be able to come back. So speaking, it's also led to the creation of other podcasts besides the House of Ed Tech podcast. And when I started this, again, because of my wife, who said, I'm tired of listening to you talk about education and technology, you should start a podcast. I started out doing this because I wanted to have my voice out there. I got tired of being a retweeter. Okay. I've been on Twitter since 2008, and I just got tired of, just constantly retweeting other people's stuff. And I, I, I remembered, or I realized that I have an opinion, I have a point of view, and I have a perspective. And I wasn't really getting the traction in the early days of education Twitter, where my voice was being heard. You throw a tweet out, it's like throwing a tennis ball into the ocean. Okay, you have to throw a lot of tennis balls out into the ocean before they start like hitting each other, and maybe people start to notice your specific tennis balls that you're throwing out there. But anyway, so this is the beauty of live. And this is not prepared. I'm off the cuff here. What was I saying? Starting the show. So podcasting gave me the opportunity to put my voice in what I'm passionate about. There are any number of things that I could create podcasts about, but I love education. I love teaching. I love whether it's students or children or adults. I love helping. So that's how I see what I do as an educator, whether it's at a middle school or high school or, at the college level or running professional development workshops. I like helping, and creating this content has allowed me to help way more people than I could have ever imagined. As we get here in the end of my 6th year, I'm going to be approaching, almost 300,000 total downloads of the House of Ed Tech podcast. Over the last 6 years, the number of people who are listening to each episode as I release them is going up. I mean, it's not hockey stick growth, but it's growth. And, if one new person listens to each episode, I'm happy. And I know that the people who are always listening and who have been listening since the beginning, you are super valuable too, because you continue to make the House of Ed Tech and other podcasts a part of your anytime, anywhere professional development. So I started out doing the one show every 2 weeks because I'm married, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I'm an educator. And I list those things in that order because if I didn't, she would be upset that she was not at the top. But I love you, dear. So I started out doing the one show every 2 weeks because that's what I had time for. And then slowly, podcasts and podcasting are kind of like a drug. And my name is Chris Nesi, and I'm addicted to podcasts and podcasting. So House of Ed Tech turned into, or it began to take on, podcast PD, which I'll talk about in more detail later. Maybe we'll see Stacy and AJ here in the live stream. Again, if you're watching and you want to join in and, have some conversation about podcasts, go to chrisnesi.com/join and you can be a part of the show, similar to call-in radio. So that led to Podcast PD, which I also do every 2 weeks with Stacy and AJ. And that's every 2 weeks in the weeks I'm not doing House of Ed Tech. So I went from podcasting every 2 weeks to podcasting weekly. And I love it. Okay. I love editing. I love recording. I love learning about technology like this to help create content. It's super fun. And then doing those 2 shows then led to being connected with Matt Miller and Casey Bell and being asked, do I want to produce a podcast? So I produced the Google Teacher Tribe podcast. I'll talk about them later as well. But if you want to get on that train, go to googleteachertribe.com. So they do their show weekly, except for the summers. So now I was producing 3 podcasts weekly. Well, 2 podcasts every 2 weeks, fortnightly, as they say, and then taking on production on another podcast that is weekly. So got to hit those deadlines, make that a part of my life, which led to Assist Learning with Jen Kronk, which led to Partial Credit with Jeff Heil, Jess Lubinsky, and Donnie Piercy. And most recently, I've added another podcast to the production lineup, and that's the Burned In Teacher podcast with Amber Harper, which you can find at burnedinteacher.com. And the first episode that I produced for Amber dropped today, and that's a conversation that she had with Gretchen Bridgers over at Always a Lesson. Oh, speaking of all these podcasts, before I even got into producing for other people, I wanted to connect with other podcasters and educators. So listening to podcasts about podcasting has certainly been instrumental. So shout out to Dave Jackson at School of Podcasting, Ray Ortega at Podcaster Studio and host of the Podcasters Roundtable, Daniel J. Lewis from the Audacity to Podcast, and, Podcasters Help Desk, and just so much great content. The feed from Libsyn. And I mean, podcasting has just, if you've been watching this for the last, 12 minutes, I like podcasts. I like podcasting. I love podcasts. So again, just want to throw out, if you're watching and you'd like to join in, go to chrisnesi.com/join and you can be a part of the show. Make sure you tweet this out, share the live stream. Again, we're here on YouTube and I am being powered today by StreamYard. So lots and lots of fun. Okay. But as I was saying, starting my podcast and then wanting to connect with other people who do this, like me, who are educators and creating education content, led to the creation of the Education Podcast Network, which is, I get fancy on the graphics here. This is the beginning of a presentation or a slideshow that I put together to talk about each of the shows on the network. So as you can see, we have here Jennifer Gonzales and Jake Miller and Sheldon Akins, who are 3 fantastic people in education who create great podcast content. And I thought their faces looked nice to put on the cover of this slideshow. So the Education Podcast Network, I started in 2015 and used that network as a way to connect with other educators and bring together the best in education podcast, which I think is still an under-promoted and under-publicized area of podcasting. It would certainly be great if Apple and Apple Podcasts, invested a little more, not even money, but a little more exposure for educators and teachers who are creating great content, high quality content for people for their own personal and professional development. I think that would be really great. So, yeah. Live stream is live streaming. Let's see. Da, 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 da. That. All right. So I will take a little bit of time here and let's talk about a lot of the podcasts on the Education Podcast Network. Let's make me a little smaller. There we go. So the Education Podcast Network, it is podcasts for educators, podcasts by educators. Let me take away that little a bumper thing there. Let me throw this up. edupodcastnetwork.com is the place that you can get all of these great podcasts, which I'm going to talk about each of these podcasts. And you know, let's do this. All right. So the Education Podcast Network, what is it all about? As I record this and stream this, we offer 27 podcasts produced by 36 humans, and we have one goal, and that is to create valuable content for educators around the world, not just here in the United States. And that's the beauty of podcasts. Whatever podcast you listen to, they are global. You can make an impact and have your message reach a worldwide global audience. We're about community. This is a photo from just this past summer at ISTE 2019 in Philadelphia, and this was our cheesesteak meetup. So we have a number of our network members in here. We got Stacy Lindes, AJ Bianco, Matt Miller, Casey Bell, Dan Krynis, My Ugly Mug. Yeah, that's me, Chris Nesi. Jake Miller, Jen Giffen, Jesse Lubinsky, Sam Fessich. So we've got some great podcasts here on the Education Podcast Network. So let's go through them, and I'd love to share with you a little bit about some of the great education podcasts out there that are part of the EDU Podcast Network family. So first up, we have Educational Duct Tape. This is a relatively new podcast, just entering its second season, and the Educational Duct Tape podcast focuses on viewing ed tech as a tool to meet goals, address learning standards, and solve problems in the classroom. Much like duct tape is used as a tool that can solve a plethora of problems in our lives, Jake Miller sits down each week with some different inspiring guests with awesome ideas for using tech in the classroom to share and discuss some awesome ideas. You can find more at jakemiller.net, and it is a great podcast. It's a podcast that I never miss because it's well produced. The guests are great. The content is great. Jake brings a lot of great energy to the world of education podcasting, and it's just fantastic. And this year, he added a new wrinkle. He used to do the podcast weekly, and as he comes back here for what he's calling season 2, he's doing the podcast every 2 weeks. And in the weeks he's not doing the podcast, and he normally releases on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday now, he's doing the EDU Duct Tape Twitter chat, which is based on the previous week's podcast episode. Now, I think this is a fantastic idea. I'll be honest, I wish I thought of it first, but certainly go out and you could be a part of Jake's Twitter chat, EDU Duct Tape hashtag on Twitter. And he will also have the guest of the show the previous week co-moderate with him. And that gives us, the listeners, to be a part of the conversation and answer the same questions and interact with the guest. So, for example, this year, he's already had his chat with Tony Vincent. So certainly a great thing. I'm not sure. I think this week is another chat. I'm not sure. I think this week. No, this week is an episode. Next week will be a chat. So make sure you tune in for that. One of my favorites, another favorite, well, really any podcast I listen to is a favorite podcast. So the Google Teacher Tribe podcast, hosted by Matt Miller and Casey Bell. You know Matt Miller from Ditch That Textbook fame, and Casey Bell from Shake Up Learning. I produce this podcast, and I have produced it since episode 1. And let's just take a second and applaud what Matt and Casey, and to a very lesser extent, what I've done with this podcast, as they are now in their 4th year. Okay. First, they do take the summers off. So June, July, and August. And they are approaching 100 episodes. Today, September 30th, 2019, they released episode 92. Pretty sure. Let me double check. Let's double check that. Helps if I bring accurate information to a live stream. Yes, episode 92, which is titled 10 Tips for Google Trainings and PD. But back to my original point. They are approaching releasing 100 episodes, and they are also very quickly approaching, and this might be the episode that does it, they are approaching 1 million downloads. 1 million downloads. 1 million downloads. That's amazing. It is amazing that so many people have listened to this content. Okay, we sometimes forget how powerful our voices are. And certainly the information and the content that Matt Miller and Casey Bell put out there is fantastic. Okay, the Google Teacher Tribe is a weekly podcast, and that's designed to give K-12 educators, and I'll be honest, anybody who uses Google in education, even if you're working with preschoolers or you're working with college students, and Google is heavily a part of what you do, you're going to get practical ideas for using G Suite and other Google tools. So definitely, if you're not listening to this podcast, you need to go out to googleteachertribe.com and you need to subscribe to the Google Teacher Tribe podcast. A relatively new podcast on the Education Podcast Network, On Education, out of the great country of Canada. Mike Washburn is definitely from Canada. There's a lot going on. Technology, grading policy, planning, grading, iPads, conferences, grading, classroom management, grading, curriculum, special needs. Did you hear me say grading? The guys at On Education, Mike Washburn and Glenn Irvin, they get it. On Education is here to help. Glenn and Mike have honest conversations about teachers, teaching, and everything in between. It's time that you join them. Join the conversation. Go to oneducationpodcast.com. High production value, great conversations, and I'm really excited that On Education is a part of the Education Podcast Network. Shooks and GIF. And in this case, it is GIF, not Shooks and GIF. That's a whole other podcast. But Shooks and GIF, the podcast, hosted by Kim Polishuk and Jen Giffen. You can find their podcast at shooksandgif.com. Shooks and GIF, the podcast, is a weekly podcast by Canadian educators Kim Polishuk and Jen Giffen. The podcast aims to share EdTech treasures with the audience in hopes of creating an aha moment and encouraging listeners to take those ahas and give it a go. A fantastic podcast. You can find more at shooksandgif.com. One of the most delicious podcasts on the Education Podcast Network. This is the EdTech Bytes podcast, hosted by Gabriel Carrillo. You can find more at edtechbytes.com. Let me tell you a little bit about EdTech Bytes. EdTech Bytes is a podcast about all things EdTech and food, hosted by Gabe Carrillo. He interviews teachers, leaders, and innovators to discuss the latest trends in educational technology, many times while sharing a meal together. So subscribe, tell a friend or a colleague, and remember that great conversations happen when we break bread with great people. Buen provecho. And that's from the podcast description. Gabe is a really good dude. Definitely you want to check out and make this podcast a part of it, because it's not just education technology. He also talks about really good food. And hey, education, technology, food, even if you listen to just the food half, it's a great podcast, and he's got some great conversations in his back catalog. So head over to edtechbytes.com. An OG member of the Education Podcast Network, if this was the NHL, Jennifer Gonzales is one of the original 6, but we had more than 6. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The Cult of Pedagogy. Teaching strategies, classroom management, education reform, technology. If it has something to do with teaching, Jennifer Gonzales is going to be talking about it. She interviews educators, students, administrators, as well as parents about the psychological and social dynamics of school. She talks about trade secrets and other juicy things you will never learn from an education textbook. And that's a fact. I've been listening to this podcast since episode 1. Her podcast is, I want to say, just as old as mine, maybe a little older, maybe a little younger, but I've listened to every episode. Even the ones where I look at the title and I say, it's not for me. But you know what? I tune in because I enjoy listening to Jennifer Gonzales. Actually, funny story. Well, I first met Jennifer Gonzales back at ISTE 2015 when it was in Philadelphia before 2019. And I remember there was going to be a session on podcasting at ISTE. And I think this was the only session on podcasting on it at ISTE in 2015. And myself, Jennifer Gonzales, Stacey Lindes, Angela Watson, Matt Miller, a couple of other people, we walked into this session and it was anything but a session on podcasting. It was a sales pitch for something that was not even related to podcasting. It was just, I'll be honest, it was a garbage session. Okay. And then all of us and some other people, we walked out and we sat on the floor outside the room and we had an actual session on podcasting and education in and around it. And it was fantastic. And it was so great to speak with Jennifer Gonzales in person. And this was shortly after the network had launched. So we were meeting for the first time. So it was just super cool. Jennifer Gonzales is one of the most awesome human beings I've ever met. And I'm happy to call her a friend and somebody who I can reach out to and ask questions of. And actually, if you listen to her podcast, you feel the same way. Okay. Jennifer Gonzales, before she was podcasting, was putting out great blog posts and comments on education on her website, cultofpedagogy.com. So you definitely want to head over there. And I don't know an educator who listens to podcasts who isn't listening to this show, but if that's you, you need to head over to cultofpedagogy.com, subscribe to the podcast, or go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts, search up the Cult of Pedagogy and make it a part of your everyday, anytime, anywhere professional development on the go. Another original member of the Education Podcast Network, the Always a Lesson Empowering Educators podcast with Gretchen Bridgers. You can find more at alwaysalesson.com. Educators, is your passion tank running on empty? Look no further. Gretchen of Always a Lesson has a double dose of just what you need. Come fill yourself up with an empowering educators podcast to start your day feeling empowered. Gretchen does a great job. And like I said a few minutes ago, she is this week's guest on the Burned In Teacher podcast with Amber Harper. So you can get a little more insight into Gretchen and who she is and what she does. And it's not her first time on the Burned In Teacher podcast, but definitely go check out the Always a Lesson Empowering Educators podcast. Great conversations. And, Gretchen is a great person. Okay. So definitely support her podcast, subscribe to it, start listening to Always a Lesson. It's a great, great show. Okay. Next up, we have the Kindergarten Kiosk podcast with Kathy Crane and Lindsey Jarmon. You can find their podcast at kindergartenkiosk.com. Mother-daughter host Kathy and Lindsey are educators who discuss topics relevant to the education of our youngest learners. Being that I have a child in the second grade and my youngest son is in his second year of pre-K, this podcast has proven to be invaluable. Now, if you don't have young children or you don't teach young children, certainly consider recommending this podcast to somebody you know who does teach kindergarten or pre-K or first grade. So the school that you teach in, if you're in an elementary school, certainly recommend and show this podcast to those people in your building or your life who are working with our itty bitties, our littles. There's just so many things to call these tiny learners. But definitely head over to kindergartenkiosk.com and learn a whole bunch from Kathy and Lindsey. Here's another relatively new podcast to the Education Podcast Network, and this is EduMagic, a podcast for pre-service teachers. This is hosted by Dr. Sam Fessich. You can find EduMagic at sfessich.com. And this is a podcast for future teachers. Okay. Join Sam Fessich as she interviews pre-service teachers who are using EduMagic to rock their college careers. Other guests include current teachers and administrators who share tips and stories to help our pre-service teachers become educators of excellence. EduMagic is also a book from EduMatch Publishing. So definitely, if there's a pre-service teacher in your life, or maybe you find yourself in a situation where you are a cooperating teacher and working with a student teacher, or you've got a pre-service teacher observing you, or there's one in your building, recommend this podcast to that person who wants education to be their career. And I'll be honest, not just because it's on the network, I do listen to this podcast and it keeps me fresh. It makes me think, even as somebody who is in their 12th year of education, it gets me thinking. Now, some of the stuff like interview tips and things like that are not as relevant to my everyday practice, but certainly there's a lot of tips and tricks. And Sam is a big fan of technology and education. And she does a great job, one, producing this podcast, and two, working with pre-service teachers out at Grove City College, just outside of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So make this podcast a part of somebody's Anytime, Anywhere PD, and go check out sfessich.com for her blogs and also episodes of the EduMagic podcast. Teaching, Leading, Learning K-12 by Stephen Miletto. You can find his podcast at teachinglearningleadingk12.podbean.com. And this is a podcast for administrators and teachers. Okay. It provides ideas and resources for everybody. So if you're a teacher, a leader, a teacher leader, this is a great podcast where Stephen interviews some great people. And if you've never listened to this, Stephen has a great voice. You know what? Actually, I'm going to play Stephen's bumper so you can get a little taste of Stephen. Where is it? Here you go. Here's a little sample of Steve Miletto.
Hi, I'm Steve Miletto from the Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12 podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Stephen is buttery smooth. So just imagine what a whole episode of his podcast would sound like. So definitely check it out. Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12. Okay. Get the right screen up there. Here we go. Hey. Look at this podcast. In fact, I'm actually going to come back for this one. Yeah, let's come back for this one. Yeah. So Podcast PD. Yes, now you see my name on the screen. And Podcast PD, I talked about it at the top of the hour when I started this live stream. And Podcast PD is anytime, anywhere professional development. This show started thanks to Stacy Lindis, who is the female on the podcast cover art that you see. Stacy Lindis was the first person who came up to me and said, I'm a fan of your podcast. And this happened at an ed camp in Ed Camp, New Jersey, a number of years ago. And I was taken aback. One, to meet somebody who was a fan, and she fangirled. She doesn't really fangirl so much now because, I don't know, we're friends and she can beat me up and stuff like that. But I was the first education podcast that she listened to. And, if you listen to Podcast PD, you know that each episode we kind of poke fun at Stacy, AJ, and I about how many unlistened to episodes that she's had or has currently in Overcast, which is the best podcatcher of choice on iOS. But she wrote a blog post called Podcast PD, where she talked about using podcasts for professional development. And we went from Well, AJ and I were like, this could be like a Twitter chat. So we started Podcast PD as hashtag Podcast PD, and we did it as a weekly Twitter chat on Sunday nights where we talked about how to create podcasts. We also had chats about the value of listening to podcasts for professional development and also teaching with podcasts. So that's how that started. Again, that was back in 2015. Yeah. It wasn't a podcast right away, but that's how it started. It started as a Twitter chat. And then me being me and me being a pusher, the Twitter chat turned into doing some live streaming on a website called Blab that's dead. And then in some weeks where maybe it was like Mother's Day or holidays that were Sundays that we didn't have the Twitter chat, what we would do is we would then record an episode. Okay, so I actually do have some not lost, but some archival episodes of things that we put out that we would talk about the topics we would have had a Twitter chat about, but we recorded it and put it out as a podcast. And then the chat sort of went away and we sort of shifted gears and we decided, hey, let's actually produce a podcast. So our content for this show is available at podcastpd.com. So definitely check it out. We have great conversations. And for me, the value of this podcast is it allows me to talk about basically anything else in education that's not education technology related. I do the House of Ed Tech podcast, and that kind of puts me in a box of what I can talk about. I do have the House of Ed Tech thought, where I use that as a segment of the show to really talk about anything that I'm interested in talking about. Sometimes it's related to technology, education, life, whatever the case may be. It's just a little corner of the podcast that I can call my own besides the whole rest of the show. And Podcast PD lets us have conversations. Now there's 3 people. So it's fun to have 2 co-hosts to bounce ideas off of. And, we decided to turn into podcast form things that we were already talking about on Voxer. So it was just a natural fit. One of the things that makes this show unique is, or something special and fun that we do, is every year around the holidays, we do something called the 12 Days of Podcast PD, where we put out 12 episodes in 12 days, and each of us makes a recommendation of a podcast episode or an entire podcast that you should be checking out. Now, this version of Podcast PD we've been doing for 50 plus episodes, and it's been 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. Yeah, we're in year 3. So it's really exciting. It's a really good show. It's got the production value that only I can bring to a podcast. So, it's not going to sound bad. And definitely, certainly check it out. Connect with Stacy on Twitter at IronTech. Connect with AJ on Twitter at AJ Bianco. You can connect with the podcast on social media at podcastpd. And that's actually a podcast hashtag. What am I doing here? That's actually a hashtag that we use and you can use for any podcast that you get professional development from. Hashtag podcastpd. We use it for our episodes. I use it when I talk about all sorts of stuff related to podcasts for professional development. So start using hashtag podcastpd. And second to that, go to podcastpd.com and check out our podcast. All right. So we're approaching 9:40. So we are 20 minutes away from the halfway point of our broadcast. So I just want to take a second to remind you that if you want to be a part of this live stream, go to chrisnesi.com/join and you can be a part of the stream. You can come in, ask questions about how to podcast. I'm happy to talk about why and how I do what I do. And if you create content, I would love to have you also come on and share what you're doing in education podcasting. So that would be a lot of fun. All right, let's go on with our presentation. All right. So we've got Teachonomy Talks with Chuck Poole. You can find his podcast at teachonomy.com, which Earlier this year, Chuck redesigned his entire website. It looks great. Looks great on mobile. He did a really nice job revamping and I don't want to say revitalizing, but just changing the whole dynamic of his website, teachonomy.com. And Teachonomy Talks is a podcast for busy teachers like you, like me, who want to be inspired, encouraged, and empowered each and every week. I lost my screen. The goal of the podcast is to give you nuggets of value in 5 to 7 minutes so you can walk away energized, refreshed, and ready for the day. So go check this out. A lot of inspirational stuff. It's amazing when I listen to Teachonomy Talks how Chuck is able to find education inspiration where you would not think you could find it. In certain movies and quotes, books, signs he sees at the bus stop. He sees education everywhere, like so many of us do. One of the things I learned when I was becoming a teacher was that being a teacher is not something you can ever really turn off. Probably not till you retire. And even then, you're probably still seeing the world through the eyes of a teacher. Next up, we have the Assist Learning Podcast. And this is a really fun show because what am I doing here? There we go. This is another education technology based podcast, but it comes at it from the special education side of things. So this is dedicated to helping teachers and families assist students with learning disabilities. In this podcast, Jen Kronk explores the intersection of instructional technology and special education. I'm also partial to this one because I produce it, and Jen's been on a little bit of a hiatus, but she certainly has a great back catalog of content, and I am sure that we're going to be producing new episodes of Assist Learning very shortly. But she is working hard to further herself, so I know she's taking some classes and pursuing some more learning, and I'm sure that's going to translate into some great episodes in the near future. For more, you can go to assistlearning.libsyn.com. Next up, we have the Leader of Learning podcast hosted by Dan Kreines. If you're familiar with my work, you've heard Dan Kreines on the House of Ed Tech before. We got to hang out face-to-face, mano a mano at ISTE 2019. He was a part of the live streaming that I did there. And the Leader of Learning podcast itself, this podcast explores transformational leadership in education. It is where educators come to find inspiration to transform education through effective leadership. It's a community where educators can realize their leadership potential regardless of their position or their title. For more information and to subscribe and connect with Dan, you can go to leaderoflearning.com. Dr. Greg Goins is no stranger to the Education Podcast Network. This is his second podcast on the network. He initially started with a podcast called Going Digital, and then he has shifted and he now has this podcast called Reimagine Schools, which you can find at anchor.fm/Greg-Goins. And it's hosted by Dr. Greg Goins. This podcast features many of the nation's top educators, authors, and innovators in K-12 education, with an emphasis on leadership development, scaling innovation, and transforming the public school system. Guests have included some of the world's most prolific thought leaders in education, including Ted Dintersmith, Ted Fujimoto, Ian Jukes, Alfie Kahn, Grant Lichtman, Mark Prensky, and Dr. Tony Wagner. The Reimagine Schools podcast is a proud member of the Education Podcast Network. And use on social media the hashtag Reimagine Schools. Okay, before I get to this next podcast, I am actually going to take a little bit of a break for a second. And I'm going to put up here this. There we go. Okay. I'm going to leave this up on the screen for just a second, and I am going to play some of somebody else's podcast because I need to step away from the live stream for a second. So bear with me, folks. A part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to right now. Shows on the network are individually owned and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
And there's going to be days where you're like, I'm trying all the things and nothing's working. And then go back, like have that staff meeting of one, look at your paper and say, okay, this is the feedback I've gotten from mentors or from other people in the building. Have I done all these things? And then you're tracking what you did.
Welcome to the Burned In Teacher Podcast. I'm Amber Harper, and the educators on this podcast are brave enough to share their stories of burnout with the world. On BIT, we get real, we get honest, and we take action. Action against the burnout with stories from burned out teachers, advice from experts, and actionable steps you can take today to beat the burnout and become a happier, more fulfilled human being. Let's get started. Hey there, Burned In Teachers. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 44 of the Burned In Teacher Podcast. One part burnout and all other parts action, inspiration, and support for teachers dealing with burnout. I'm your host, Amber Harper, and I'm so grateful, and I'm actually extra grateful today that you're spending your precious time with me. I'm feeling, like I just said, a lot of extra gratitude, and I'd like to take a minute to tell you why. See, the day that this episode airs is actually September 30th, which is National Podcast Day. But that's not all. September 17th was the 1-year birthday of the Burned In Teacher Podcast. Aw, it's not a baby anymore. And I was too into my daily grind to even notice. You see, I've talked about this before. Being busy can derail you from taking time to show gratitude for all of the growth and connections that have happened when you're trying something new. So I want to take a minute to celebrate podcasts and how they're having a serious impact on our world and on our personal and professional growth by sharing some podcasts that have influenced me over the years. I'll link those in the show notes. So the quick and dirty list is this: Entree Leadership by Dave Ramsey, the She Did It Her Way podcast by Amanda Boleyn, Rise by Rachel Hollis. Lately, I really loved The Way I Heard It by Mike Rowe, the Speaker Lab podcast with Grant Baldwin, the Courage and Clarity podcast with Steph Crowder, the 10-Minute Teacher podcast with Vicki Davis, and of course, I have to give my EPN crew a shout out here. I'm so extremely honored and grateful to be part of the Education Podcast Network founded by Chris Nesi, who, by the way, is now editing the Burned In Teacher Podcast because I realized that it was something that I needed to let go of, and I wanted to practice what I preach in order to avoid burnout. Thank you, Chris, so much for doing this. I am a part of this network of educators serving educators, and I'm so honored and grateful for it. So I want to give all of them a quick shout out. And if you've not listened to any of these, I strongly suggest that you do. They all touch on different pieces of education, and you can certainly find one from the Education Podcast Network that serves your needs. Okay, here we go. We have the House of EdTech, the Google Teacher Tribe, Educational Duct Tape, On Education, Shooks and GIF, EdTech Bytes, The Cult of Pedagogy, Empowering Educators, Kindergarten Kiosk, Edu Magic, Teaching, Learning, Leading K-12, Podcast PD, Teachonomy Talks, Assist Learning, Leader of Learning, Reimagine Schools, Instant Relevance, Partial Credit, Teachers Need Teachers, Leading Equity, Shake Up Learning Show, Infused Classroom, Ditch That Textbook, Principal PLN, Transformative Principal, and About the T in STEM. Thank you all so much for inviting the Burned In Teacher Podcast to be a part of your network. I'm so extremely grateful, and especially to Angela Watson, Casey Bell, and Matt Miller, who even before I started podcasting had such a huge influence on my day-to-day teaching and my perspective in education. Thank you. And happy National Podcast Day. And happy late 1-year birthday to the Burned In Teacher podcast. We are now a full week into fall here in the United States, and you can smell the changes in the air. Although I'm a summer girl myself, I just can't help but get a little giddy about the changes that are to come. And you know me, I love me some changes. Yes, I know not all listeners are from the States, but here in the Midwest, the leaves are changing, the air is cooling. Well, at least it should be. It's 85 degrees today in Indiana, and ciders of all types are hitting the shelves. Okay, I want to ask you a question. I'd love your opinion. Are you a PSL lover? You know, pumpkin spice latte. I am not. I could take it or leave it. I think too much of anything isn't great, but how about you? So jump on social media, tag me in a picture of you with a nice, warm or cool pumpkin spice latte. Are you a fan or are you not a fan of pumpkin spice? What if it went away? How would you feel? Do you see what I did there? The good old what if. It's a scary thought. What if there isn't enough? What if I don't make it? What if they don't like me or my ideas? What if they get mad at me? Last week, we talked about the two sides of what if, and I'd love to hear your feedback on that as well. Have you flipped your what if on its head yet? Have you thought about what would happen if you asked what if with a different perspective? Like, what if I don't change? What if I said no? What if I did something different and scary for me, but good for me at the same time? Kind of looked at self-care a little bit differently, right? Well, get into the Burned In Teacher Facebook community at bit.ly/BIT community and share with us your story and what you're doing to ask yourself, what if? I want to know what you're doing with what you're hearing here on the podcast. And I couldn't imagine following last week's episode any better than we are today, because to begin where we are, no matter where we are or again, what season it is, we have to reflect. Now, you stop rolling your eyes. I see you burned in over at teachers, and I see that look of concern on your face.
All right. That is a little sample of the latest episode of the Burned In Teacher podcast, episode 44. For more, you can go to burnedinteacher.com. But for now, I'm going to go back to my presentation where I'm talking about all the podcasts on the Education Podcast Network. And the next podcast that I want to share with you is the Instant Relevance Podcast, another new podcast on the network earlier this year in 2019. And the Instant Relevance Podcast is a podcast featuring the latest news and resources to make learning relevant for all students. This comes to us from hosts Dennis Sheeran and Raymond Steinmetz. Dennis is the author of Instant Relevance, the book, using today's experiences to teach tomorrow's lessons. You can connect with the podcast on Twitter at InstantRel, R-E-L, and you can get their podcast on Anchor, anchor.fm/instant-relevance-podcast. A great show, nice nuggets of information. Dan, I don't know why I keep saying Dan. Dennis and Ray do a great job on the podcast. Next up, we have the Partial Credit Podcast. This is a podcast entering its second year, and I produce it, so that means it sounds good and all such things. It's hosted by Jesse Lubinsky, Jeff Heil, and Donnie Piercy. Their website is partial.credit. Yes, .credit is a top-level domain extension. Partial Credit is the podcast that brings together education, pop culture, and shenanigans. Let me tell you, shenanigans run amok on this podcast. But the education and pop culture is also really good too. Jeff Heil, Donnie Piercy, and Jesse Lubinsky, they span 3 generations because Jeff is old, but that's okay. They tell him that to his face too, so I'm not being mean to Jeff. They've got you covered coast to coast. You got Jesse Lubinsky in New York, Donnie in Kentucky, and Jeffrey from San Diego. So when you listen to this podcast, make sure you sit back, relax, and earn your partial credit. Also, a little behind the scenes tidbit, shout out to AJ Bianco, who does the voiceover work for partial credit. Check is in the mail, buddy. Check is in the mail. Next up, another great podcast for new teachers, and that is the Teachers Need Teachers podcast, hosted by Kim Lapre. You can find the podcast at teachersneedteachers.com. Teachers Need Teachers is the podcast for new and beginning teachers. It's inspired by the questions beginning teachers are asking around the web, plus the questions that you didn't know you should ask. Kim Lapre will help you clear the confusion and figure out what to focus on so you'll have the most positive impact on your classrooms without losing your freaking mind. Kim Lapre wants to help you navigate through those crazy first years of teaching while maintaining your sanity and a personal life. Definitely go and check it out at teachersneedteachers.com. You just heard a sample of the Burned In Teacher podcast from Amber Harper, a new podcast for me to produce, a current member of the Education Podcast Network. Let me tell you what the show is all about. So Burned In Teacher is all about going from being burned out to being burned in. On this show, Amber Harper interviews teachers who are or have gone through burnout, and they share with you what they are doing or have done to beat it. She also interviews experts in the field of teacher burnout, education, productivity, and happiness, and basically all things burn in. There's also episodes where she shares her own experiences and answers questions from you and other people in the Burned In Teacher community. So again, you want to head out to burnedinteacher.com. Next up, we have Leading Equity. Leading Equity is hosted by Dr. Sheldon Akins, and you can find more at sheldonakins.com. This podcast focuses on supporting educators with the tools and resources necessary to ensure equity at their school. On this podcast, you, the listener, can expect to hear interviews and stories from voices of equity in education today. A great podcast. Sheldon does a fantastic job, whether it's his own thoughts or the people that he's speaking with. If equity is of a concern to you, and let's be honest, equity needs to be a concern to all educators, no matter where you teach or who you teach, equity is something we need to be aware of and work to improve. So definitely check out the Leading Equity podcast. Here's somebody who should look familiar to you. Shake Up Learning with Casey Bell. You can find more about this podcast and subscribe at shakeuplearning.com. You know Casey Bell from the Google Teacher Tribe podcast, but here she is with a solo show. She's an EdTech leader, international speaker, author, blogger, and a digital learning coach for K-12 teachers. Casey helps teachers learn to meaningfully integrate technology in the classroom through her presentations, coaching calls, and powerful interviews with educational leaders. I was even a guest, episode 14, where we talked about podcasting in education. Listening to this show, you will learn how to integrate technology and digital learning tools, grow as a leader, and refine your instructional strategies. Casey is an expert in Google for Education and G Suite tools. You know this if you don't live under a rock, or you listen to Google Teacher Tribe, or you've ever been to shakeuplearning.com. The Shake Up Learning Show will help you become a more dynamic teacher, and you will be shaking up the learning in your classroom. One of the newest education podcasts on the scene, and yes, I do edit this one and produce this one as well. New episodes should be coming back in January, and that's according to hosts Holly Clark and Tanya Avereth. You can find their podcast at anchor.fm/infused classroom. And in this podcast, Holly and Tanya take you behind the scenes with leaders in education. They give you insights into what's happening in classrooms around the globe, and they showcase online platforms that are disrupting education. I enjoy editing this one because the guests that they speak to are people that I've never heard of, but they're people that you should be aware of. They're having conversations with people who are working in schools all over the world. So definitely go to anchor.fm/infused classroom and check out this show as well. I feel like, this podcast means a lot to me. The Principal PLN podcast. This is a podcast, one of the first education podcasts I started listening to. They used to live stream it in the first year that they were doing it. And this was one of the first podcasts where I interacted with the show. I got to know the hosts, and that's a super powerful feeling when you listen to a podcast, because when you listen to podcasts, it's very intimate. If you're watching me right now or listening to this after the fact, this is an intimate experience. If you listen to House of Ed Tech or any podcast, it's just you and the person speaking, or the host of the show, or the guest. You feel like maybe you're a fly on the wall, or they're talking directly to you. And then when they mention your name or they interact with you, that feels so wonderful. And Teresa, Jess, and Spike, they did that for me. The Principal PLN is, again, hosted by Teresa Steger, Jess Johnson, and Dr. Spike Cook. They are committed to creating podcasts that are informative, innovative, and fun. The concept of the podcast was developed by Teresa Steger, who, when she first came up with the idea a few years ago, was a first-year principal seeking ways to learn from others. Teresa reached out to Jessica Johnson, and they also connected with Dr. Spike Cook, and they began podcasting in September of 2013. They are well over 100 episodes of their podcast, and you want to go to principalpln.com. It's a really fun podcast. They've had some great names in education and education leadership on their show, and there's just so much value. Okay, so go to principalpln.com. And thank you to Jess, Teresa, and Spike for making an impact on me as an educator. And they've also all been guests on the House of Ed Tech podcast. It's probably at a point in time where I should bring back Teresa and bring back Jess for a second appearance apiece, because Spike has been on the show twice, and definitely you want to check out those episodes. They're fantastic. Next up, we have Transformative Principal with Jethro Jones. You can find his podcast at transformativeprincipal.org. This is another OG podcast on the network, as well as Principal PLN, both original founding members of the network. And in this podcast, most principals are running from one emergency to the next. Jethro Jones will help you find the actions needed to transform your school so each student has an amazing experience. Each week, Jethro interviews a principal or educational leader who is making a real difference in the life of his or her students. Jones interviews them to learn how to be the best principal that he can be, and it just so happens he shares that conversation with you with hopes that you will learn how to improve as well. When he interviews principals, he often breaks the interview up into two parts so you can have time to process and implement something from each guest. So definitely head out to transformativeprincipal.org, and make this podcast a part of your professional growth, whether or not you're an educational leader in a formal or informal capacity. And last up, we have About the Tea in STEM, hosted by Dr. Heather Monthi. You can find her podcast at heathermonthi.com. The Tea in STEM education, discussing technology education and innovation for teachers, parents, and educational leaders. Dr. Heather Monthi is sharing about digital literacy, computer science for all, cybersecurity, and STEM education. Great production value, great topics. Go to heathermonthi.com, subscribe to this podcast, and make it a part of your life. For everything that I've talked about so far about the Education Podcast Network, you are going to want to go to edupodcastnetwork.com. Again, we're a podcast network that encourages you to think about your profession and succeed in the world of education. Whether you're a first-year educator or a seasoned veteran, there is a podcast for you, as I've demonstrated by sharing all of the shows. They're produced by educators, and they want to help shape education through meaningful discussion and content. You can connect with the Education Podcast Network on Twitter. We are at EduPodNet. Again, here are all of the hosts on the Education Podcast Network. So I do want to shout out Holly Clark, Spike Cook, Raymond Steinmetz, Teresa Steger, Dennis Sheeran, Kim Polishuk, Donnie Piercy, me, Chris Nesi, Heather Monty, Matt Miller, Gabriel Carrillo, Casey Bell, Steve Mileto, Jesse Lubinsky, Stacy Lindes, Glenn Irvin, Dan Kreiness, Jethro Jones, Jessica Johnson, Jake Miller, Gretchen Bridgers, Tanya Avrith, Jeffrey Heil, Amber Harper, Jennifer Gonzalez, Greg Goins, Sam Fessich, Sheldon Akins, Jennifer Kronk, Kathy Crane, AJ Bianco, Jen Giffen, Lindsey Jarmon, Chuck Poole, Mike Washburn, and Kim Lepre. Thank you for all of your hard work and dedication to the podcast that you create, whether it's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. You are taking time and you are putting out your voice, and this should be celebrated. I wish that Apple Podcasts had a special area just for the Education Podcast Network. So if you watch this or you see this or you know somebody at Apple, hey, let's make a little noise. I would love to have the Education Podcast Network be even bigger, include more shows. So if you want to get your podcast on the Education Podcast Network, I make no promises, but if you'd like to apply, we do have that available. You can go to edupodcastnetwork.com and you can apply to be on the network. There's a button at the top called Join. And there's a Google form you could fill out, and I will personally review your podcast. So again, on the website, you can go to edupodcastnetwork.com and click on the Join EPN button. You can also learn more about our shows by clicking our shows. And if you want, we also have a store where you can get some swag. So that certainly helps to make the network go. And I'm a big supporter and fan of anytime, anywhere professional development. So there you go. All right. So that's all I have to say about the Education Podcast Network. I will leave that up on the screen for just a second. Again, if you want to join the conversation, again, I'll be here until 11 a.m. today. So that's a little less than an hour from now. Yeah, a little less than an hour from now. So for the remainder of this live stream, again, where we're celebrating International Podcast Day 2019, you want to come on, talk about your podcast or ask questions about how to podcast, go ahead, go to chrisnesi.com/join, and that'll get you right here in the live stream. And I would love to have you part of that. Or you could certainly leave a comment if you're watching along on YouTube, and I can certainly address your questions or your comments right here on the screen. So it would kind of look like this, or here's another example of your comments and how they could show up on the screen. So I would love to have you be a part of it. Also, if you're watching, make sure you share this. If you're on YouTube, this is really the only place you can watch it. So share this on Twitter and let's get some people engaged and participating. Okay. All right. I think we can be done with the sharing. I'll keep that up there for now. A lot of people sharing this, but hey, don't just like it. Come on in. Let's do this. Okay. So let me talk about some things related to the how-to of podcasting. Okay. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? Let me shrink this down. I have a Google slideshow that I can use to guide what I'm going to say, because having a little guidance is going to be better than me just trying to speak off the top of my head. So let's try that. Let's bring up a presentation that I've given before, and I'll use that to guide what I say. But again, if at any point you want to join in, again, go to chrisnesi.com/join. Again, if you're just joining the live stream, my name is Chris Nesi from the House of Ed Tech podcast. I've been podcasting for almost 6 years, creating the House of Ed Tech, which you can find at chrisnesi.com. And right now I'm just pulling up some notes that will guide me in talking about the how-to of podcasting and the power of podcasts in education. Okay. And again, if you want to join, just hop on in. If you're not subscribed to the House of EdTech podcast on your mobile device, iPhone, Android, iPad, or even on your computer, wherever you listen to podcasts, if you go to chrisnesi.com/go, G-O, that'll take you to where you can listen to the podcast on your particular device. So it'll open up an app that's already on your phone, or it's going to recommend to you apps that you can use to listen to podcasts. My favorite podcast catcher for iOS is the Overcast app. And I think on Android, making a lot of headway is the Google Podcast app. So certainly worth checking out. All right. That's loading. All right. There you go. Okay, let's do this. Sorry for that. I've been fighting a little thing here. The beauty of live, the beauty of technology. There we go. Okay, I think this is going to come up now. All right, let's go. There we go. So the benefits of podcasting in education. And I'm going to leave down here. If you want to join, just click on what you can't click on it. Go to chrisnesi.com/join and you'll be able to come right here into StreamYard and I can get you up and we can talk about podcasts in education, your favorite podcasts, whatever the case may be. But now let's talk a little bit about the benefits of podcasting in education. Okay. So the benefits of podcasting in education. First and foremost, it allows you, a podcast will connect you. Okay. It'll connect you, your students, your school, your district, and it's going to connect you with your community. It's going to connect you with the state you're in, the country you live in, and the world. In a world where students are podcast. It allows you to connect. Okay. Podcasts connect. I have connected with people through my podcast and podcasting all over this country, all over the world. I've been able to connect with people in Australia. I've been able to connect with people in Europe, South America, Canada, and all over this country, all over New Jersey. And again, it just speaks to the benefits of what podcasting can do for you. Okay. Podcasting allows you to have global reach. Okay. You can be wherever you are and you can reach points all over the world because if you've got an internet connection, you can listen to podcasts. You can stream content. Okay. You reach 100% of the people. I don't teach math. This is the percentage of people that you won't reach if you don't have a podcast or if your students aren't creating content. Sure, you can have a blog, you can have a YouTube channel. And I certainly suggest if you're at the beginning of this content creation journey that you try it all. Try everything. But I think you'll find that podcasting provides a lot of value because there are not a lot of podcasts in the world. You know, we've all seen or heard statistics or seen data about how much video content is on YouTube and how much goes up every hour or every minute or how much is available. It's a lot of content and there's a lot of noise and it's tough to be discovered. An English speaking blog, let's say, you know, again, you can write, but do you ever know if somebody's reading it? What if nobody comments on your blog? Now, the same thing can be said about creating podcasts, but you know what? Getting your podcast discovered is a lot easier than getting somebody to sit down and watch your YouTube videos or read your blog. Okay. Because when I listen to podcasts, I can do that anywhere. I could be sitting here preparing lesson plans and I can listen to podcasts. When I commute to work, I listen to podcasts. When I go to the gym, I listen to podcasts. Not everything is education or specifically for educators. A lot of podcasts I listen to are educational. They also entertain me. They make me laugh. They make me think. No podcast has made me cry, but they certainly all make me feel something. But if you're not creating that content, well, then you're not reaching anybody. What are the benefits? Okay. They're flexible because they're available 24 hours a day. It's on-demand learning and listening. Students could potentially listen for longer than they'll watch or read something. So if you're creating content for your students, you might find an easier time getting them to buy into listening to a podcast than having them find time to sit down and watch a video or read something. Getting students to create content is certainly valuable. I was fortunate enough last year to get a Donors Choose grant to get some podcasting equipment for my classroom, where this year I'm really integrating what we're using that equipment for. I do a daily morning show with my students, and we're here at the beginning of the school year. So the plan is to get them to be producing their own morning show, which is not anything to do with social studies, but I'll also have it available in my classroom to have students creating audio content for projects or reflecting about the content in the class. I'm just fortunate enough to have something called advisory, which is like homeroom in the high school, where 10 out of the 20 minutes, we do a little live morning show. So that's a whole lot of fun. You can use podcasts to review lecture. You could record thoughts at the end of each week or every couple of days about lessons you've done. And it's another way to reach your students and provide information that they can use to go back and listen to. It's great if you have students that are absent. Okay. You could also use it to make up for missed classes. You could provide content that they can listen to if you know you're going to be absent. I actually did a great episode of the House of Ed Tech where I talk with Nate Nagel about some strategies that he uses when he knows he's going to be absent and how he can still be present even if he's not physically in the classroom. So definitely go to chrisnesi.com and you could search Nate Nagel and that episode will come right up for you. I just don't know the number off the top of my head. What else? Obviously, there are a lot of benefits for the mental and visual impairments some of our learners may have. Okay, if you have somebody who has visual impairments, well, they're probably good listeners, and listening to audio content would certainly prove to be valuable to them. So now what? Let's talk about the podcaster's toolbox. Okay, so here are some recommendations for hardware, software, and just general best practices for if you'd like to be creating content either for yourself or if you want to work with students to create podcast content. So first, let's talk a little bit about hardware. If you've got a smartphone, raise your hand. Okay. So you can start podcasting with your smartphone. Your students can start podcasting with their smartphone. In terms of microphones, the microphones you see here on the screen, this is the ATR 2100 and the AT 2005. Okay. I have both of these mics. I'm doing this video right now into an AT 2005. The ATR 2100 and the AT 2005, they're both what we call USB and XLR microphones. So that means the back connection here, if you're watching on the video, this is XLR connected, and it also has a USB connection to connect directly to a computer. The USB connection on both of these microphones is compatible with obviously a Windows computer, a Mac computer, and also works with Google Chromebooks if that's the environment that you're in. If you have iPads or iPods, you can connect these microphones to a tablet as well. You would just need the Apple Lightning to USB dongle that comes with the camera kit, and then you can connect this microphone to an iPad, an iPod, or an iPhone, and now you've got a great handheld external microphone. Both of these microphones are also dynamic microphones. Okay, I'm going to do a test, and I'm going to demonstrate for you what a dynamic microphone does. Okay. So when I'm talking into a dynamic microphone, you hear me right now because I'm talking into the microphone. Okay. Now you can see my hands, and I'm just going to move this microphone out of the way, and you're not going to be able to hear me, but I'm going to keep talking. So here we go. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. X, Y, and Z. So you could not hear me when the microphone was not directly in front of my face. The other type of microphone that exists is called a condenser microphone. So if you had a condenser microphone, when I moved the microphone away from my mouth, you would still be able to hear me. It would sound echoey or like I was in the distance, but you'd still be able to hear me. Okay. Um, a condenser microphone is great for recording music or using it in a properly treated space. So could I use a condenser microphone here in the House of EdTech studio? Yes, because I have things hanging on the wall. It's not a classroom made of cinder block or brick. Um, there are things that will absorb, and it's not going to pick up a whole lot of echo in a space like this. Or I could record in a closet or put a blanket over my head. A dynamic microphone is a lot more forgiving. Okay. The windows are open here in the studio, and they are cutting a tree down across the street. You can't hear that because it's not directly coming into the microphone. That's happening behind the microphone. Okay. Now, a microphone that I don't have pictured here is also the Samson Q2u, which is from Samson and is another microphone. And all three of these microphones less than $80. Of the three, the Samson is currently the least expensive, and I think that checks in at about $50 or $60 available on Amazon. If you notice here on the screen, if you go to chrisnesi.com/school podcast, that's the page where I have all of my recommendations and links to episodes of the House of Ed Tech that I've done about podcasting and other resources. This presentation, links to all of the things that I recommend and talk about. Some of these are affiliate links. I am an Amazon affiliate. So if you shop on Amazon using my links, I do get a little bit of kickback. Doesn't cost you anything more, but it helps to support what I do here on the House of Ed Tech. And actually, if you were to bookmark chrisnesi.com/Amazon, then anytime you shop on Amazon, you'd be helping out the podcast if you bookmark chrisnesi.com/Amazon. But I'm not here to turn a profit, just here to make my little podcast go. Okay. All right. Some optional things. Okay. All the way on the right, we have a USB mixer. And then the smaller device, that is a digital audio recorder. Now, that's actually what I have right now. I used to have the microphone here connected to my computer via USB. But now I have the Zoom H6, which is a portable digital audio recorder. So exactly what you see on my screen, the small device, I have that on my desk right here. And I have that connected to my computer via USB. So I'm getting the XLR connection into the device, which then goes into the computer. Now you might be asking, Chris, why are you not just connecting it via USB? Well, this would allow me to connect multiple microphones, and I can take the device, I can take the recorder, and I can go and I can record up to 4 people. As you can see right here, where's the pointer? These are the connectors. This module, this is replaceable. You can actually get another module that you can connect up to 2 more XLR microphones, and it just works. You can record to an SD card. I can control the levels. I've got one of these in my classroom, so that's how I do the live streaming. And is it necessary? No. If you just bought a USB microphone, you can start the podcast. Okay. The mixer that you see here, all a mixer allows you to do is mix together multiple sources of audio. I'll talk a little bit before I'm done today about how I do that, but I don't do it with a physical mixer. You're in for a treat when I show you how I do what I do with this. Hosting. Your files need to live somewhere. So where should they live? I use Libsyn, Libsyn. Okay. I've been using Libsyn since I realized that hosting my podcast on Google Drive was not a good idea, because in the first year, it got to the point where I was growing. So more people were listening, and people would start to send me messages saying, "Hey, Chris, try to download the latest episode of House of Ed Tech." And I can't. I see it, but I can't download it. So I had to pony up the money, not a lot, to get actual podcast media hosting. What does it cost me to use Libsyn? I pay $7 per month. And it's well worth it because I use the Libsyn RSS feed, and it's like 99.99999% uptime. So if you were to go to chrisnesi.com and ever not see it, you'd still be able to get my podcast, because I use Libsyn's podcasting tools, and they've got, they've been in the industry since 2004. They know podcast media hosting. If you want to use it for yourself or with students, you can use the promo code Nesi, Nesi, and that can get you up to 2 months free on Libsyn. Now, here's the tip. How do you get 2 months free? Well, they'll give you a month, but if you sign up, wherever you sign up in the month, you get that month free, or the rest of that month, and then the whole next month. So if you sign up on the first of a month, you'd get 2 months free, because they want to make sure you get a full month. Just don't sign up on January 1st, because then February is only 28 or 29 days. So sign up on the first of like any other month, so you can maximize the amount of time you get for free. And again, promo code Nesi will do that for you. Blueberry is also the 1 and 1A of podcast media hosting. Spreaker is what I use for what I do at the high school to do the live streaming. They have great desktop software for live streaming and recording and putting together a podcast. That's also the app that I recommend that you can use on your phone to have a high quality podcast. Google Drive. I would only recommend Google Drive as a host if you're not planning to distribute the podcast anywhere other than sharing some MP3 files with, say, classroom parents or, the people in your district. But if you're going to, at any point, be sharing this on a global scale, or, more than 100 people might be listening to it, you're going to want to use an actual media host. Okay. I have Anchor on here, and Anchor is a funny thing. I don't recommend Anchor's specific tools. And with Anchor, you want to make sure that if you sign up for Anchor, that you don't click the big buttons that make it easy, that they're telling you will submit and share your podcast everywhere you could share a podcast. Because here's what happens. When you do that, unless you do the settings, they're going to really control your podcast RSS feed, which is what people are subscribing to. Okay. Without getting into all of the technical stuff, that's like your radio signal. Okay. That you want to have complete control of that. And if you just let Anchor do everything for you, then you're not in control of it. Okay. So if you want to use Anchor, make sure you follow the steps, so that way it's in the more advanced settings where you're in control and your email address is the one that's being used, and you would manually submit the RSS feed to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, all the places you might want to get your podcast listed in the various directories that are available. Okay. You want to make sure that you control that yourself. And I would recommend using Anchor to host files that you create somewhere else. I don't think they have great recording and editing tools. That it sounds a little choppy. I've listened to some people who record things directly on Anchor, and it's really tough to make it sound like a quote unquote good podcast. Now, I'm not an audiophile, I'm not an audio snob, but using something like Audacity or GarageBand would certainly be valuable, and then upload and use Anchor as a host. But make sure that you're in control. In places you never want to put content, don't use SoundCloud. I'm not even going to fully explain that, but don't use SoundCloud as a media host. They don't support podcasting. They don't support podcasters. Their interface and how they support podcasts is outdated. Okay. They're like 5 steps behind, if not more. And then if you're doing this for your school or your district or your classroom, I don't recommend hosting media files on your school website, because, well, bandwidth can get expensive. And if you're podcast were to get popular and become widespread, or, maybe there's like the Oprah effect and like somebody important mentions your show, well, your IT team isn't going to be too happy if you crash the servers, or they get a call that says, hey, what type of content are you putting out there and why are so many people trying to access it? Let's talk about software. How are we going to record education podcasts? So some of these are web-based. Some of these are available on Windows or Mac, or they're accessible on Chromebooks. Obviously, things that are accessible on Chromebooks are going to be web-based. StreamYard is a relatively new piece of technology. It's a couple years old, and it allows you via the web to have conversations with up to 4 people that you record. So, for example, on Podcast PD, or if I interview somebody for House of Ed Tech, I now use StreamYard to record that conversation, because what it does, it records the participants locally on their computer and uploads that audio in separate files. So if I record an episode of Podcast PD with Stacy and AJ, when we're done recording, while we're recording, we can see each other. So it's not difficult to not have crosstalk, because we can wave hands. There's a chat that we can use to say, I'd like to say something. And then that eliminates a lot of the crosstalk issues that people have when they podcast if you can't see each other. But it records us locally. So if you're recording with people who have microphones, you're going to get their best sounding audio, and you can download it as a WAV file or an MP3 file. I certainly recommend that you're downloading your files as WAV files, because that is the best that you compare to an MP3. It's not compressed, and it's the best form of audio. Okay. So that lets you download that, and then you can bring that into a multi-track editor like Audacity or GarageBand. And I prefer Audacity between the two. And then you can edit people in the multi-track. So what that means is each person's on their own audio track, and that makes it great for editing and eliminating crosstalk and really slicing audio and not, losing quality or impacting, if people are all on the same audio track. So for people who had been recording in Google Hangouts, let's say, if you all start talking at the same time, you can't get in there and really clean that up. Okay, that's more difficult. Zencastr, like StreamYard, records all the participants for free. You can use Zencastr with 2 people. Oh, real quick, go back to StreamYard. StreamYard you can pay for by the month, or you could pay for the year, and it is the best $200 that I've spent for a year. Okay, I use it on any time I'm recording something with more than just me. So if it's me and a guest, or what I do with Podcast PD, this is my capture platform for recording those conversations. It used to be Zencastr. Zencastr is still valuable, but I like the video component. But if you feel you don't need to see your guest or your co-hosts, then Zencastr could be the option for you. Okay. If it's you and one other person, you can use it for free for, I think, up to 8 hours a month. And then you can pay to get up to, I think if you pay, it's a lot of people. But again, you're not going to have 10 people on a podcast and have it sound good. But, you can use that. I think I messed up. So StreamYard is what I'm using here to live stream. So this would allow me, okay, so Google Hangouts on Air is gone, but I'm streaming to YouTube. So if I wanted to pull the audio from this video when I'm done, I could do that, because StreamYard lets me live stream. And I talked about StreamYard at the top of this broadcast. Okay. Squadcast is what I talked about to record conversations. Spreaker Studio, that lets you, again, that's from Spreaker, and you can record mobile on the mobile app, or you can get their desktop software for Windows, MacBook, and as of the start of the school year, Spreaker is the only podcast host and creation platform that you can use on Chromebooks. So you can use their software. If your Chromebooks have access to the Google Play Store, you can get the Spreaker app on your Chromebooks. All right. Audacity is my audio editor of choice. It's what I create all of the shows in when I do my editing and how I do my post-processing. There's a video that I put out last year about my Audacity secret sauce, how I do the vocals, and that's how I'm using compression and, a noise gate, and how I'm processing the audio and equalizing it and normalizing the audio tracks. And that video I'll include a link in the comments for this broadcast and video. It's a nice, simple bit of processing that works on male voices. It works on female voices, and it just makes the voices sound a little more rich and not, just the basic levels. Okay. GarageBand, if you're a Mac person and you're comfortable in GarageBand, cool. If you've never edited audio, I really don't recommend that you start with GarageBand. I personally don't think it's very good for editing and creating podcasts. Anytime I try to help somebody, there's always an issue with how to output or get the stuff out, or how to slice it and dice it and, put stuff together. And another great web-based tool, and certainly for more, definitely connect with AJ Bianco. He's got a little more experience with Soundtrap than I do, but it's a web-based audio editor. So similar to Audacity, but definitely through the browser, through Chrome. And the nice thing about Soundtrap is it lets you connect to Google Drive. Now, they do have an education version, which is not free, and a non-education version, which is free, but is not as COPA and FERPA compliant as their education version. So you do what you need to do to get your kids recording audio, but it connects to Google Drive, and it's web-based, so you can do multi-track sessions. And it's kind of like working on a Google Doc, but for audio, where I could be here in my house working on a project, and somebody could be at their house and also come into the same project, and we can record and talk and, do those things. So a possibility, just some of the software that's available to you to create and record conversations and edit your audio. And all of what I'm saying, you can find at chrisnesi.com/school podcast with links to everything. So let's say you're doing a school podcast and you want to decide, well, what am I going to do in my school podcast? So here are some segment ideas. The state of the building. Okay. Have your principal or your superintendent sharing the latest big picture updates. Maybe that's a whole podcast. Okay. And you have like the principal show for your school, or you bring the principal or the superintendent or a supervisor or a vice principal in to your studio to give a little segment or record an update about what's going on in the school or the district. Certainly use a school podcast to announce things that are going on in the school for, the school play or the art show or different events that clubs are doing. Okay. What's coming? What's happened? Let's share the stories of our schools. Another great segment that people like is the idea of the faculty spotlight. Interview your colleagues. Have students interviewing teachers. Let's humanize our greatest assets and let's get people to know the human side of us as teachers. We don't just sleep in the closet, right? I mean, sometimes we'll fall asleep at our desks, but hey, student shout outs. Give students a reason to listen and participate in their school podcast. Give shout outs. It's like listening to the radio. Okay. Community connect. Solicit information from your community, local businesses, other schools in the district. If maybe you're the high school or the middle school or, the Board of Education, bring together the community. Schools are part of the lifeblood of our community besides libraries. You're welcome, Caitlyn. And potentially, to offset some of the costs. Local businesses might be willing to help offset media hosting or help purchase equipment. And then, you're promoting their business or the local pizza place or anything like that, or a local restaurant. Build those relationships and teach students how to build those relationships. And then, of course, you can do things where you tell jokes, have fun, be entertaining. There are no real rules to podcasting. Even in education, there's just best practices. Some podcast tips. Have a plan. Have a vision. Just hit record. And like Rudy, stick with it. Okay? When you start podcasting, you don't have to be NPR. You never have to be NPR. I'm not. Do I sound good? Yeah, but I'm a team of one. I'm a team of one for a lot of podcasts, but just stick with it. Don't just sit down, flip on the microphone and start yapping. Although for some people, maybe that's what it takes to get started. Remember, what you record, you don't have to let anybody listen to. You can start recording and play radio and see how it sounds and get comfortable. Find your voice, get your feet under you, but don't ever not release. Don't ever not hit record. Okay. You never know what you're going to capture. and you never know when you might find something that you find useful. But again, if you don't like it, don't release it. Okay? If you make a mistake, edit it. It's really that simple. Yeah, so connect with me. I'm at Mr. Nesi on Twitter, Instagram at House of Ed Tech. You can email me, mr@chrisnesi.com. All right, let's get the presentation out of here. Let's go back to me. Let's close that. Okay. All right. So we've got about 20 minutes left in the live stream. If you've got questions or comments about how to podcast, I would certainly love to answer them. If you want to come on and share your favorite podcasts, that would be cool too. I'll spend a little time here sharing the podcasts that I enjoy and that I subscribe to. So I'm just going to bring up Overcast on the web. And this is why I love Overcast, because I can use it on my iPod that I keep in my car. But I can also access it through the browser. And I have access to all of the podcasts that I listen to in a browser. And it's kind of like DVR, where if I stop on the iPod and I'm connected and it connects to the internet while I'm at school, when I get there, then at lunch I can go on the browser and I can continue listening because I don't take the iPod in and out of my car. So some podcasts that I enjoy and that I'm happy that they are in my life. One of the podcasts I really enjoy is the 5 a.m. Miracle podcast with Jeff Sanders, which you could find at jeffsanders.com. And this is a podcast and provides productivity strategies for high achievers. Now, I don't know if I'm a high achiever. I work hard, but this is certainly a valuable podcast in my life. I've had the opportunity to talk to Jeff Sanders, and he's been creating content for many years, and it's just super valuable. New podcast that I just talked about on the House of Ed Tech, episode 141 from the New York Times. This is the 1619 podcast, and it is basically not commemorating, but bringing to light the fact that 400 years ago, slavery was introduced to North America when the first slave ship arrived, and how really that's when America began. And this kind of goes through and chronicles how slavery has impacted us from 1619 until today. Great podcast. Well done. Very highly produced. A podcast that I talk about a lot along with AJ on Podcast PD is the Art of Manliness Podcast, which you can find at theartofmanliness.com. You don't need to be a man to listen to it. It's just great conversations, a lot of history, a lot of life. Again, not just for men. School of Podcasting, Dave Jackson. One of the podcasts that taught me how to do what I do is the School of Podcasting. The other doesn't exist. Well, it exists, but it's by a different name, and it's not a how-to podcast any longer. A newer podcast that I'm enjoying is the Evan and Caitlyn podcast. One of the YouTube channels that I subscribe to is Evan and Caitlyn, and they are two DIYers, and I love their videos. They're funny, they're engaging, they do cool stuff, and they podcast, and it gives you kind of behind the scenes of what it's like to be a YouTuber and create content. And they're funny, they play games in their episodes, so it is definitely entertaining and a guilty pleasure. Another podcast that I get education value from that's not necessarily an education podcast is Hidden Brain from NPR, hosted by Shankar Vedantam. And I've been listening to this podcast since it first started and really, really enjoy this show. Certainly worth checking out. I'm getting a lot of sports information from the Locked On Podcast Network, and that's your team every day. So I listen to a local-based Yankee podcast, a Knicks podcast, Giants, the New York Rangers. I like hockey, basketball, football. And another one, Locked On MLB, which is all about the overview of Major League Baseball, which is my favorite sport. Oh, hey, we got a comment. So I'm going to throw that up there. Coming to us from Eric. Have I ever used Zoom? What do you think about the new Rodecaster Pro? So I'm going to say that you're probably asking me about Zoom.us, the meeting recorder program. I've used it to host meetings. I've been in sessions that have been used to record. I just think that there are better ways to get better audio quality. Is Zoom usable? Absolutely. If that's your only option, go for it. But if you can use something else, you're going to get better audio quality than using, than using just Zoom.us recordings. If you do use Zoom.us, make sure that you configure the settings to record each person separately. So that way you do get the individual tracks. So that way you can pull it into, again, Audacity or GarageBand or Soundtrap or your audio editor of choice. Okay. Make sure you get the separate tracks. The Rodecaster Pro, I wish it was on my desk. I don't have $600 to put into it. But for me, that would be purely a toy. It would be great for on the go. I think the Rodecaster Pro would be great in a classroom. But for how I have my setup, and again, I'll share my screen before we go about how I do the sound effects and everything. I do everything here on my Windows computer. But if you've got the $600, and you don't have another way to maybe have a soundboard or easily integrate phone calls, I mean, it is a very powerful device. And I know they recently updated their firmware on the Rodecaster Pro. So you can do the multi-track recording. You can record to the SD card that you could put in, and you don't have to take that out every time. Certainly, it's definitely made the right kind of waves in the podcast industry. And I think, yeah, if you got the money, go for it. And if that's going to enhance your setup, it could certainly replace a lot of equipment that maybe you could sell. So you wouldn't necessarily need a separate audio interface, or some of the other things, maybe a compressor or a limiter. You could certainly do a lot of that stuff within the Rodecaster Pro. And thanks for checking out the broadcast, Eric. I appreciate it. So if you have questions or you want to join in, please, chrisnesi.com/join will get you to be a part of the show, as I'm here for a little bit of time until 11 o'clock. But I'll be honest, I don't have school today. So if you're watching this and you want to come on and we go past 11 o'clock, I'm cool with that. Just go to chrisnesi.com/join if you want to be a part of it. I'm just kind of wrapping up the broadcast. And again, I'm willing to go longer. I'm just talking about some of the podcasts that I get value from and that I really appreciate and that I've learned from. Dave Jackson, in addition to School of Podcasting, also does a podcast on Saturday mornings called Ask the Podcast Coach, which you could find at askthepodcastcoach.com. And he does it much like I'm trying to do here, where you can go and get your podcast questions answered live with Dave Jackson and Jim Collison. Jim Collison is from theaverageguy.tv. And if you go to askthepodcastcoach.com/live, you'll get to their YouTube broadcast, and he does a /join, and you can go on and get your questions answered about how to podcast, and super entertaining, super valuable in terms of content. So again, if you want to click join or leave a comment, please feel free. Okay. What else do I enjoy listening to? Radio Lab from NPR. I enjoy listening to that. It's entertaining and educational. Shout out to my podcast compañera, Stacy Lindes. A couple years ago, she recommended to me the Tech Meme Ride Home, which is a short, I'd say 25 minutes or less podcast 5 days a week, where it basically catches you up on the world of technology for that day. Nice, easy, entertaining, informative, and certainly as one who is passionate about technology, I certainly enjoy listening to that podcast as well. This American Life, every morning, I listen to Up First from NPR, which in 15 minutes or less, I'm getting the news of the day, which is great for teaching social studies because I can play those episodes in class, or I can use those topics to jumpstart conversations with my students, which is, of course, very valuable. What else? Better Podcasting. Shout out to Stargate Pioneer and Stephen Jandrew of Better Podcasting from the Gonna Geek Network. Better Podcasting is for hobby podcasters. Now, I kind of teeter-totter between hobby podcasting and pro podcasting. For me, I think of myself as a pro podcaster based on the time, the energy, and the effort that I put into production and production quality. I do have Patreon. I have my awesome supporters. So there is some money generated from my podcast to help keep the podcast going. I mean, I'm not going to, get rich, but that money certainly helps me pay for web hosting, my website, things like Squadcast and things that's a way to offset what I'm investing. Other than that, it's me putting my money into creating this content and trying to provide value. What else? Another new podcast I just started listening to is called The Memory Palace. And that is hosted by, as I pull it up here, Nate DeMeo. And this is short, surprising stories of the past. Sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes hysterical, always super great. This is for history buffs, fans of American public radio and shows like This American Life. These are short episodes. They are definitely less than 20 minutes, and it's The Memory Palace, part of Radiotopia. You could find more at thememorypalace.us. So, yeah. The Story Behind with Emily Prokop. This podcast is on hiatus currently, but I'll make that a little bigger. Then you can actually see the behind the scene, not the behind the scenes, but the Overcast interface. It's the extraordinary history of the ordinary. Short podcast, 9 minutes or less. High production value. And it actually led to Emily Prokop writing a book of the same name, The Story Behind. And it's a good podcast. Definitely go back and check out her back catalog, and hopefully she'll come back to the show and produce some new content. She's got another podcast that she hosts. And yeah. So what else we got? Again, it's 10:52. Hope you're having a great International Podcast Day, and take some time today to share the podcast that you enjoy and that, you listen to. Okay. It's been my pleasure to come on here for the last hour and 50 minutes to talk about podcasting. I spent a bulk of the time talking about the Education Podcast Network and really highlighting all of the podcasts on the network and the idea of teachers getting professional development from podcasts, which I think is very valuable, not just because it created. Even if I didn't have, the guts to create my own podcast, I would still probably have discovered and be listening to podcasts to learn and grow as an educator, because I get to choose what I listen to, what I subscribe to, and, through taking notes, I get to decide how I want to grow. And podcasts really let me shape what I do as an educator. Okay. If you're interested in learning how to create your own podcast, please connect with me. I am at Mr. Nesi on Twitter. You can also email me feedback@chrisnesi.com. If you're not subscribed to the House of EdTech podcast, go to chrisnesi.com/go. If you're not subscribed to Podcast PD, go to podcastpd.com/go. For all of the shows on the Education Podcast Network, you can go to edupodcastnetwork.com. And of course, I'm still Chris Nesi. So this has been a lot of fun with about 6 minutes left in my live stream. I really enjoyed getting on here, and I hope you find value from everything I shared in this video. Certainly, maybe you scrubbed over stuff, you skipped over stuff. Hey, that happens. But it was more fun for me to get on here and share and do this and lead by example, because maybe you've thought about live streaming and now you can see a lot of the things that I inadvertently demonstrate about how to use StreamYard. Okay. It's just a lot of fun. I'll be honest. I wish that more people came out to watch this. I wish that if more people had or anybody had shown up, that you would have, come in and participated. But hey, it's fine. This video is now out here and I'm doing something I enjoy. And I guess maybe if I live streamed more often, people would want to, hop on and see what's going on. So there's a lesson that I learned. If you want to get people to engage and participate, you got to put yourself out there. You can't just, start tweeting the night before or the day of and expect people to show up. But I hope you got value from this presentation. I hope you check out the podcast. I would love it if you checked out, chrisnesi.com. Let's help if I can spell my name. So here is my website again. Yesterday I released my latest episode 141, which is a review of Catchbox, which go and check it out. chrisnesi.com/141. Here's the website. If you go to listen, that'll bring you to a page where you can listen to all the past episodes, gives you all the different places that I'm at to subscribe. The RSS feed, which is another easy way to subscribe to podcasts. If you want to help and also make the podcast go, maybe you can't become an awesome supporter and support the show on a regular basis, perhaps picking up some House of EdTech swag. So we got t-shirts, mugs, cell phone cases. That's a whole lot of fun. If I go to, and this is me using Teespring, but I also use TeePublic to produce some t-shirts. Both t-shirts are of a high quality, but I do have some other things available, which let me put up, some designs. So if you want to pick up a shirt about the Education Podcast Network, or you just want to be a fan of podcasts in general, go to chrisnesi.com/swag. And if you pick up anything that I've designed, certainly take a picture of it. Hey, there you go. Go right now, enter your email address, and you can get 15% off your purchase. There you go. I don't even have any control over that. So there you go. All right. I said that I would show you how I do my sounds and stuff. So let me bring over some behind the scenes from one monitor to the next. So here on the screen, on the Windows computer, I use an app called Voice Meter Banana. I also have Voice Meter Potato, and this is a digital mixer. So you see the green lines popping here in the video. That is the channel that my microphone is on. Let's go back to the 0.5. There you go. Okay. And then this is an app on Windows called Jingle Palette. This lets me bring in my sound effects. So for example, if I go to HOET, I have all the different sound effects. So if I was going to roll an interview and I was doing it live, I could bring in this sound effect. Or if I had a phone number for you to call, I could have done something like this. Hey, if you want to be a part of the show, you can go to chrisnesi.com/join, and that'll make you a part of the conversation. Hope you join in. And there's also, I can do other little sound effects like.
Oh, hell no.
Oh, hell yeah. Then we have the podcast PD soundboard, where this is how I have fun with Stacy and AJ behind the scenes. And, you hear things like,
no, this is Bull Dinky.
Hey, whoa, slow down, AJ.
Mr. Podcast over here.
Yes, I am Mr. Podcast.
Oh my goodness, that's so simple.
Yes, podcasting is so simple.
Ugh, that's killing me.
Stacy, I don't know why you have to do that at times. Okay.
True that, yeah.
Well, sometimes. Yeah, sometimes.
I'm funny to watch all the time because I cannot keep a straight face.
That's right. You can't keep a straight face because you like to laugh.
Can you bring me my lunchbox?
No, I can't bring you your lunchbox.
What the hell did you just say?
Whoa, slow down, AJ. We don't need that. All right, now you guys are just getting out of control.
What?
Oh my God, Becky.
All right. Okay. So that's a little bit of the behind the scenes. My name is Chris Nesi from the House of EdTech podcast, co-host of Podcast PD, producer of the Google Teacher Tribe podcast, Assist Learning, Partial Credit, the Burned In Teacher podcast, and who knows, maybe I started producing another podcast while I was recording and live streaming here. For more information about the House of EdTech, go to chrisnesi.com. For more information about the Education Podcast Network, go to edupodcastnetwork.com. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Sorry.